The lake was unnervingly quiet that evening, the stillness broken only by the rhythmic splash of my paddle cutting through the glassy surface. As the sun dipped below the treetops, I spotted something unusual: a small boat anchored in the middle of the lake. Its motor was tilted out of the water, and it bobbed slightly with the ripples, looking utterly abandoned. I hesitated, but curiosity pulled me closer. As I neared the boat, my flashlight beam swept across the deck. There was a fishing rod, a tackle box tipped over, and my stomach turned, a crumpled tarp with dark, dried stains. Blood! I froze, debating whether to paddle away or investigate further. The air around me grew heavier, and a faint, low whistle carried across the water. I whipped my head toward the shoreline and saw a man standing there, partially obscured by the tall reeds. He waved, his gestures frantic, as if beckoning me toward him. For a moment, relief washed over me. Maybe he was the boat's owner. Maybe he needed help. I paddled quickly toward the shore, my mind racing with explanations. But as I approached, I noticed something strange. His clothes were torn, his hair wild, and his eyes didn't hold the gratitude I expected. Instead, they were sharp, calculating. When I reached the bank, he grabbed the front of my kayak with one hand and pulled it ashore with startling strength. His other hand held a rope. "You shouldn't have touched that," he muttered, almost to himself. His tone was calm, too calm. "What do you mean?" I stammered, trying to pull my kayak free, but his grip tightened. "They'll think you did it," he said, a grim smile stretching across his face. Before I could react, he threw the rope over my kayak, tying it securely to a tree. Then, with deliberate precision, he reached for my wrist. Panic surged as I struggled against him, but his movements were methodical, almost practiced. He dragged me toward another tree, tying me to it before stepping back to admire his handiwork. "They always believe the one they find at the scene," he said, his voice low and steady. "And you're exactly where they'll find you." He disappeared into the shadows, leaving me alone, the blood-stained tarp flashing in my mind. My heart pounded as I clawed at the ropes, desperation fueling my every movement. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to free myself. I didn't look back as I bolted to the dock, adrenaline and terror driving me forward. But my relief was short-lived. When I reached the shore, police cars were already there, their lights slicing through the night. An officer spotted me and began shouting, his hand moving to his holster. My mind raced as the man's chilling words echoed. "They'll think you did it. I should have left that boat alone." It had been a long evening with my family, and I was driving home down the same highway I'd taken countless times before. The night was thick with fog, and the faint glow of my headlights barely cut through it. About halfway through my usual route, a Detour sign appeared on the shoulder. I slowed, confused. I'd never seen any roadwork in this area before. The sign pointed to a narrow, unfamiliar road branching off the highway. I followed the detour, figuring it might save me some time. But as I drove, the road stretched on, growing narrower and darker. There were no other cars, no streetlights, only my headlights illuminating the endless stretch of pavement. Minutes turned to an hour, and unease began to creep in. When I finally saw a faint glow ahead, relief washed over me. A small gas station appeared on the side of the road, its neon sign flickering weakly. I pulled in, the crunch of gravel under my tires breaking the eerie silence. The attendant behind the counter looked up as I entered, his face lined with age and something I couldn't quite place. Worry, maybe. "You're out late," he said, his voice gravelly. "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound casual. "There was a detour back on the highway, and I ended up here." His expression froze. "A detour?" He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "There hasn't been a detour on that road for years." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice faltering. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached under the counter and pulled out a stack of faded papers. Missing persons posters. My blood ran cold as I scanned the faces and names. They were all last seen driving down this stretch of highway. "You need to leave," the attendant whispered, his voice urgent. "Turn around. Go back." I bolted for the door, my heart hammering. As I reached my car, the beam of a flashlight cut through the fog. A man in a reflective vest stood in the middle of the road, waving me down. "Hey, you shouldn't be out here," he called. His voice was calm, almost too calm. I hesitated, rolling down my window. "I'm just trying to get back to the main highway," I said. He smiled faintly, stepping closer. "You took the wrong turn. Happens sometimes. Head back the way you came." His eyes flicked toward the gas station, then back to me. "You don't belong here." Before I could respond, he knocked twice on my hood and pointed down the road. I didn't wait for more explanation. I turned the car around, my tires kicking up gravel as I sped away. In my rearview mirror, I saw the flashlight beam vanish into the fog. When I finally found the main highway again, the Detour sign was gone. I've driven that stretch of road many times since, but I've never seen that turnoff again. And I haven't stopped at a gas station late at night since. My first night at the old inn, the kind of place with creaky floors, antique furniture, and a musty smell that clung to everything. My room was small but cozy, with a large mirror hanging above the dresser. As I unpacked, I accidentally bumped the dresser, and the mirror crashed to the floor, shattering into dozens of jagged pieces. As I swept up the shards, I noticed something odd. Behind where the mirror had been was a hidden compartment. Inside were a stack of old photographs, their edges yellowed and curling. Each photo showed people standing in front of the same mirror, but their faces were blurred like a smudge that no amount of focus could fix. My stomach churned as I stared at the images, a sense of unease settling over me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The room felt heavier, darker than it should have been. Around midnight, a faint whisper drifted through the air, pulling me out of bed. It was coming from the bathroom, where the shattered mirror had been. When I opened the door, the photos were gone. I froze. The air was cold, sharp enough to sting my skin, and in the faint moonlight streaming through the window, I saw movement. A man stood in the hallway outside my room, holding the broken mirror's frame. His face was shadowed, but his presence filled the space like a weight pressing down on my chest. "You shouldn't have found those," he said, his voice low and steady. I stepped back, my heart racing. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, holding up the frame as if it were a window. "This mirror was part of an exchange. You broke it, so the agreement is void." "What agreement?" I demanded, but he only smiled, a cold, hollow smile that didn't reach his eyes. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out one of the photographs. He handed it to me, and my hand shook as I took it. The photo was of me, standing in the room where I now stood, staring at the broken mirror. But the photo had been taken from behind me, showing details of the room that were impossible to see from the angle I'd been in. "This is yours now," he said, stepping back into the hallway. "You'll be the one they watch." Before I could ask what he meant, he disappeared, the shadows swallowing him whole. I slammed the door and locked it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The photo felt heavier than paper should, as if it carried the weight of something far darker. The next morning, I left the inn without looking back. But the photograph came with me, no matter how many times I tried to leave it behind. And sometimes, when I pass a mirror, I catch a glimpse of something, or someone watching me from the other side. The seaside town was small, with rocky shores and waves that crashed against the cliffs. On the second evening, as the sun sank low, I decided to explore the old lighthouse perched at the edge of the coast. The tower loomed against the sky, its weathered walls streaked with salt. The door was open, and a man in a thick sweater and boots greeted me. "Tourist, he asked with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm the keeper. Come in. I'll show you around." Inside, the air was damp and carried a faint metallic tang. The walls were lined with old ship manifests and faded photographs of sailors. One picture caught my attention, a shipwreck that I'd seen mentioned in a local museum. The wreck had been blamed on poor visibility during a storm. "That one?" the keeper asked, noticing my gaze. His voice turned cold. "Wasn't an accident." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He gestured to the large lamp at the top of the tower. The light didn't fail. It guided them straight to the rocks. The weight of his words hit me, but he continued, as though recounting a mundane story. "It's been happening for years. The sea takes who it wants, and the lighthouse helps." He motioned toward a thick logbook on the desk. "Each entry marks a wreck. Each name belongs to someone the light brought in." I glanced at the logbook, my heart pounding. Pages and pages of names stretched across decades. Then he opened the book to the most recent page. My name was there, written in neat cursive. The date was today. "No," I muttered, stepping back. "This isn't funny." He shut the book with a thud and turned toward the door, locking it with a heavy iron key. "It's not a joke. No one leaves without signing." Panic gripped me as he moved closer, the smile gone from his face. I bolted for the stairs, climbing toward the light at the top. The spiral staircase groaned beneath my weight, but I didn't stop. When I reached the top, the lamp's glow blinded me. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks below grew deafening. The keeper was right behind me. "The light's already seen you," he called, his voice rising above the wind. "There's nowhere to run." Desperate, I spotted a broken window and didn't think twice. I climbed through, cutting my hands on the jagged glass, and leapt to the rocky ground below. Pain shot through my legs as I hit the ground, but I scrambled away, the lighthouse's beam sweeping across the shore. As I ran, I glanced back and saw the light shift, locking onto me. It wasn't random. It was following me, illuminating the jagged path as though leading me somewhere. I made it back to the village, but I can't shake the feeling that the light hasn't forgotten me. Sometimes on clear nights, I see it sweeping across the sky, and I know it's still searching. The platform was almost deserted, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. I stepped onto the train, expecting the usual crowd of tired commuters, but the car was nearly empty. Just one other passenger sat in the far corner, their face turned toward the window. They didn't glance up as I walked in. The train rattled along the tracks, the faint flicker of overhead lights casting shadows that swayed with the motion. I settled into a seat near the middle, trying to shake the nagging feeling that something about this ride felt off. Halfway through the journey, the train jolted to a sudden stop, throwing me forward in my seat. The intercom crackled, and the conductor's voice announced a delay due to technical difficulties. I looked out the window, but all I could see was the black of the tunnel stretching endlessly on either side. The lights flickered again, and the air seemed to grow colder. The passenger in the corner stood up, clutching a briefcase. He walked toward me, his footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent car. When he reached my row, he stopped, leaning slightly toward me. "They know you're here," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. I froze. "Who?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he slid the briefcase onto the seat beside me and stepped back. "Take this," he said, his eyes darting toward the door at the end of the car. "It'll explain everything." Before I could press him further, a loud, metallic banging echoed through the train. It came from the door at the far end, rhythmic and deliberate, as if someone or something was trying to force it open. The man's expression darkened. "They're here." The lights went out completely, plunging the car into darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I heard the door slam open, followed by heavy, deliberate footsteps moving toward us. I fumbled with the latches on the briefcase, desperate to see what was inside, but my hands were trembling too much to open it. When the lights flickered back on, the man was gone. The footsteps stopped, and the car was silent once again. The briefcase remained on the seat beside me, but now it felt heavier, as though it carried more than just its contents. The train lurched forward, the intercom announcing that we were approaching the next station. I clutched the briefcase, glancing around the car, but the man hadn't returned. By the time the train pulled into the station, I was alone. When I stepped off, the briefcase disappeared from my hand. I don't know how or when it happened, but I haven't seen it since. Now, whenever I take the late train, I sit near the door, watching and waiting for the lights to flicker again. The forest trail was quiet, the kind of stillness that made you second-guess every rustle in the underbrush. I'd taken this path before, but somehow, I'd wandered farther than usual. My phone had no signal, and the fading light of dusk filtered weakly through the dense canopy. That's when I saw it, a stone monument standing in a clearing, surrounded by an almost perfect circle of trees. The monument was weathered, its edges softened by time. Carvings of names and dates covered its surface, most of them faded and illegible. At its base sat a single candle, still burning despite the faint breeze. The flickering light gave the stone an eerie, shifting quality, as though it were alive. I crouched to examine the carvings more closely. That's when I saw it. My own name, freshly etched into the stone. Beneath it was today's date. My stomach dropped as a sharp chill ran through me. This had to be a mistake. A sound behind me made me spin around. A man stepped out from behind a tree, holding a small chisel and mallet. He was older, his face weathered and expressionless, his movements slow and deliberate. "It's tradition," he said, his voice even and cold. "Once your name's on the stone, the woods decide." My throat tightened. Decide what? "Who stays?" he replied simply, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. He gestured toward the monument. "Every name here is someone who didn't leave." I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. "This is some kind of joke," I stammered. "I'm leaving." The man didn't move to stop me, but his eyes followed me as I turned and ran. Branches scratched at my arms, and the fading light turned the forest into a maze of shadows. The trail I'd come from was gone, replaced by unfamiliar twists and turns. I reached the trailhead, my car in sight. Relief surged until I checked my pocket. My keys were gone. I spun around, frantically searching the ground, but instead of my keys, I found the chisel he'd been holding. It lay in the dirt, its metal gleaming faintly. The woods seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing darker and the air heavier. I shouted for help, my voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. The only sound was the faint crackle of leaves behind me. When I turned, the man was there again, standing at the edge of the clearing. "The woods have already decided," he said. "There's no running now." I don't remember how I got home. One moment, I was standing at the trailhead, and the next I was waking up in my bed, the chisel resting on my nightstand. My name is still etched into the stone. Sometimes, I hear the faint scrape of metal on stone in my dreams, as if the monument is waiting for me to return. It was late, and the shortcut over the old bridge was the quickest way home. A sign at the entrance read, "Closed for repairs," but the barriers were haphazardly placed, as though someone had half-heartedly tried to block it off. I hesitated, but the bridge looked stable enough, and I didn't want to add another 30 minutes to my drive. As I drove across, the wood creaked under my tires. The bridge was illuminated only by my headlights, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the dark river below. Halfway across, I spotted a car parked at the side with its lights off, its door slightly ajar. I slowed down, pulling up behind it. The car was old, rusted, and looked like it had been sitting there for years. As I approached, I noticed a figure slumped in the driver's seat. My first instinct was to ask if they needed help, but something about the way they sat, unnaturally still, made my skin crawl. Before I could decide what to do, the figure suddenly sat upright, their head turning sharply toward me. Their face was shadowed, but their movements were stiff, almost mechanical. "They're under the bridge," the person whispered, their voice raspy and barely audible. "Don't stop." My breath caught as the car doors slammed shut. I stepped back, my heart pounding, but then I heard the faint sound of splashing, like someone or something was moving in the water below. I turned toward the railing, peering over the edge into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but rippling water, distorted by the moonlight. But then a shape moved, large and slow, just beneath the surface. My stomach churned, and I stumbled back toward my car. Whatever was in the water wasn't human. As I reached my door, a man in a construction vest appeared at the far end of the bridge. He walked toward me with measured steps, his boots echoing against the wooden planks. His face was calm, too calm, as if he'd done this 1,000 times before. "You didn't see anything, right?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. I nodded quickly, fumbling for my keys. He smiled faintly, tilting his head. "Good. It's best to keep driving." I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I jumped into my car and sped off, not daring to look back. But as I reached the other side of the bridge, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The man was gone, and so was the car that had been parked there. The splashing sound followed me all the way home. Even now, I can't cross a bridge without feeling watched, like something is waiting beneath the surface. And sometimes, when I drive late at night, I hear the faint creak of wood, even on solid ground. It started with an invitation. A plain envelope slid under my apartment door with no return address. Inside was a single card with the words, "Exclusive estate auction. One night only." A friend had mentioned this kind of thing before, mysterious, high-stakes auctions where oddities and artifacts went for absurd prices. Curiosity won over caution, and I decided to go. The auction house was tucked away in a forgotten part of town, its facade crumbling under years of neglect. Inside, the air was heavy, smelling faintly of dust and old wood. The crowd was small, but the energy was palpable. Most of the items being auctioned were strange. Antique locks, faded portraits, sealed boxes. But one item caught my attention. A weathered journal with a hand-scrawled label reading, "Do not open." Against my better judgment, I bid on the journal. The price wasn't high, as though no one else wanted it. When the gavel struck, I felt a strange weight settle over me. The auctioneer's gaze lingered for a second too long as I collected my purchase. Back at home, I opened the journal, my fingers trembling. Its pages were filled with hurried, chaotic writing, notes, sketches, and dates, but the entries quickly became unsettling. The events described weren't just familiar, they were from my life. Every detail was accurate, down to the smallest interactions I thought no one could know. The final page was blank, save for a single phrase written in red ink. "What happens next is up to you." I barely slept that night, the journal sitting on my desk like a ticking bomb. In the morning, it was gone. In its place was a note, written in the same red ink. "It belongs to the house now." Panic set in. I rushed back to the auction house, desperate for answers. But when I arrived, the building was boarded up as though it hadn't been occupied for years. The windows were covered in grime, the doors sealed tight. I banged on the wood, shouting, but no one answered. As I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. A man in a dark coat stood across the street, watching me. His face was obscured by the brim of his hat, but his presence was unmistakable. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, as if waiting. When I got home, My apartment felt different. The air was colder, and the lights seemed dimmer. On my kitchen table sat the journal, pristine and untouched. I flipped to the final page, now filled with a detailed account of my frantic trip to the auction house, down to the man in the dark coat. I don't know how the journal knows what it does, or what will happen next. But every morning, the final page updates, charting my movements, my thoughts, my fears. And every night, I see the man in the dark coat standing just a little closer to my window. It seemed harmless enough. A community cleanup event organized to clear out an old warehouse on the edge of town. I'd sign up out of boredom, looking for a way to fill my weekend. The place was massive, with towering shelves crammed with forgotten boxes, broken furniture, and rusting equipment. The air smelled stale, like dust and decay. I was assigned to sort through the smaller items: old books, photo albums, and random trinkets stuffed into boxes. It was tedious work, but as I dug deeper, I noticed a strange pattern. One box contained a stack of wallets, all in pristine condition despite their age. Another held watches and jewelry, the kind you'd expect someone to cherish, not abandon. Then I found a third box. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them. Each photo featured a different person, their faces framed in candid moments, smiling at a picnic, walking down a street, sitting at a bus stop. But none of the faces were familiar. The photos looked personal, yet they didn't belong to anyone I recognized. I turned one over and saw a name scrawled in faded ink. I checked another, and another. Each photo had a name, all written in the same handwriting. The dates written beneath the names spanned decades. A chill ran through me as I realized the names matched some of the missing persons cases I'd read about online. People who had vanished without a trace. I was still staring at the photos when the supervisor approached. He was tall and thin, with a face that seemed weathered beyond his years. His expression darkened as he saw what I was holding. "Those aren't for you," he said, his voice low but firm. He reached out and took the photos from my hands, placing them back in the box. "What is this?" I asked, unable to hide the tremor in my voice. He stared at me for a moment before answering. "These belong to people who didn't leave." His tone was clipped, almost rehearsed. "Don't ask questions. Just do your job." I should have listened. But later that night, as I sat in my car outside the warehouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When I checked the back seat, I froze. One of the wallets from the box was sitting there, open. Inside was a photograph. Not of a stranger, but of me. My name was scrawled beneath it in the same handwriting I'd seen earlier. The date beneath my name was today. I raced back to the warehouse, but it was empty. The cleanup team was gone, the lights off, the doors locked. I stood there, clutching the wallet, as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I've kept the wallet since, unable to bring myself to throw it away. But the photo inside keeps changing, the background shifting to places I've never been, but somehow feel I'm destined to visit. I don't sign up for volunteer work anymore. It was supposed to be a simple drive home. The fog had rolled in faster than usual, thick and blinding, clinging to the windshield no matter how fast the wipers moved. My GPS struggled to keep its signal, and the road seemed to stretch longer than I remembered. Then, as if out of nowhere, I turned onto a dirt road I didn't recognize. I slowed down, realizing too late that the paved highway was gone, swallowed by the fog. The dirt road stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by skeletal trees that seemed to press closer with every mile. The fog turned everything gray, muting even the sound of my engine. Turning around seemed impossible now. There was no room, and the edges of the road faded into a steep drop-off. After what felt like hours, a faint light appeared in the distance. I accelerated toward it, my heartbeat steadying at the thought of finding help. The light grew stronger until I reached a clearing where a small group of people stood in a circle, each holding a lantern. Their faces were obscured by the fog, their bodies eerily still. I stopped the car, but kept the engine running, unsure whether to get out. One of them turned toward me and pointed, their arm moving slowly, deliberately. Another one for the ritual, they said, their voice hollow and devoid of emotion. Panic set in. I shifted into reverse, but the road behind me was now blocked by the same dense fog, too thick to see through. My headlights illuminated the circle of figures as they began to move, their lanterns bobbing with every step. One by one, they turned toward me, their faces shadowed, but their presence unmistakably menacing. I threw the car in a drive and hit the gas, swerving around the group. The dirt road reappeared ahead, but the fog seemed alive, closing in around me. The trees bent unnaturally, their branches reaching across the road as if to trap me. The light from my high beams caught glimpses of shapes moving in the fog. Figures running alongside the car, their lanterns flickering like dying fireflies. No matter how fast I drove, the road refused to end. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, my knuckles white as I forced myself to focus on the path ahead. Finally, the dirt gave way to asphalt. The fog began to thin, revealing the familiar curves of the highway. Relief washed over me, but as I glanced in the rearview mirror, my breath caught. The back window was covered in handprints. Smudged and overlapping, they trailed down the glass as if someone, or something, had been pressed against it, trying to get inside. I didn't stop until I reached my driveway. The fog didn't follow, but the handprints remained. I scrubbed at the glass the next morning, but they wouldn't come off. Now, every time I drive at night, I avoid dirt roads, no matter how lost I feel. The lanterns haunt my dreams, flickering just beyond the edges of my vision. I'm sorry for any mistakes I've made, and may you all be well.